So for our first seminar of the semester, we have Dr. Nick Cohn with us. Nick completed a BS in Earth Sciences from Boston University in 2010 and a PhD in Geology from Oregon State University in 2018. He's currently a research oceanographer at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Engineer Research and Development Center's Coastal and Hydraulics Laboratory. He runs a research program involving field data collection, data analysis, and numerical modeling, focused on nearshore beach dune morphodynamics. His current work is largely focused on developing or advancing process-based numerical models for simulating marine, aeolian, and ecological processes on coastal landform evolution in both sandy and Arctic coastal systems. So please join me in welcoming Nick.
Nice to be back. I actually gave a talk here maybe 6 or 7 years ago, also talking about morphodynamics. So nice to sort of give an update on the development work we're now doing at the Army Corps of Engineers. And so I'm not sure who here is knowledgeable on coastal morphodynamics, but I'm going to talk mostly on different scales relevant to coastal foredune dynamics. And so foredunes, as you can see in this picture, are topographically high features that are typical at the backside of dunes. They occur naturally in sandy coastal systems, but not surprisingly, the Corps of Engineers also uses these and constructs them pretty regularly as a form of coastal resilience. Since they were topographically high, they limit inundation of potentially valuable infrastructure behind the beach, which is partly why I like this picture. And they're also pretty complicated because they're the aggregate effects of both marine and wind-driven sediment transport processes. And specifically today, I could talk sort of at what I'll call mesoscale in terms of how dunes develop or some of the numerical tools that we use to try to predict their evolution. I'm going to instead actually focus on scales that are much smaller and much longer than probably what I would typically talk about, in part because these are some of the core strengths that UNH has, and wanted to introduce particularly students to maybe some agency scale research that you may not think of that the Corps of Engineers may be involved in. So first, a little bit about the agency that I work for. You're probably familiar with the Army Corps of Engineers. We have district offices all around the country. These are really sort of boots on the ground engineers designing engineering features to protect against erosion and flooding hazards. So we have many congressionally mandated mission areas to protect our nation's coastlines from flooding, to provide safe navigation, really anything related to water management and sediment management. And so we have offices all around the country, but not surprisingly, these are pretty large, lofty goals to be able to understand how water moves, how it interacts with the built and natural environment, how sediment moves. And so we do also quite a lot of research. And so there's 7 laboratories that are part of the U.S. Army Engineer Research and Development Center. This is really the R&D wing of the Army Corps of Engineers. And that's where I am located. So a little bit about ERDC. There's actually 7 labs. As I mentioned, we cover pretty diverse space, really anything in sort of the environmental engineering sphere. So you can see examples on the top of our geospatial research, a lot of construction research. And not surprisingly, based on my talk, I fit in the coastal and hydraulics lab, so mostly dealing with coastal processes work. We're mostly sort of known as a civil works agency, sort of building levees or beach nourishments or dredging to maintain waterways. We also have a pretty big military mission that folks may not be aware of. In terms of the coastal and hydraulics lab, we have 3 locations. I'm located in our Duck, North Carolina office. Our headquarters is in Vicksburg, Mississippi, and then we also have a satellite field office on the Stennis campus in Kiln, Mississippi. And so, I'll talk a bit about agency type research today, but just want to make the point, I'm in a really small office, 30 people. I work for a laboratory focused, covering a pretty wide space for civil and military applications. That's, 200, 250 people in the coastal hydraulics lab. We are in a slightly bigger organization, maybe 2,000 to 3,000 people in ERDC. We're in a larger organization, the Army Corps of Engineers, trying to solve all these problems that really relies on a lot of research to meet these applied engineering needs. And then we fit under both the Department of Army and the Department of Defense. So we're in an organization that's basically composed of millions of people. And so it's really a small number of subject matter experts that are trying to really inform a lot of things at pretty high levels for a diverse range of applications in the littorals for the Department of Defense. So we do a lot of pretty wide-ranging work from basic to applied research. In terms of the topic areas that CHL works on, this is just, more or less what I just talked about, some key areas. And I just wanted to note one more thing is the University of New Hampshire just joined the Network for Engineer with Nature, which is a Army Corps of Engineers sort of implemented program. EWN actually fits within ERDC, so it's a research program that funds internal research, funds a lot of my work on nature-based solutions and design. It also funds academic partners. And so this is one of the R&D programs that is congressionally appropriated, that funds a lot of our internal research, but we probably have 6 or 7 coastal-related internal research programs that people may not be aware of that cover really everything from dredging to inlets, hydrodynamics, sediment management of all types. And so, we work internally off of a range of internal and external funds that cover all these topics that I'm talking about. All right, well, let's get more to the science. Big picture, I don't need to tell you that, sea level rise is a big threat to our systems. Changing or increasing storminess has big implications in terms of wave dynamics, also potentially in terms of wind dynamics. And so we know that coastal systems are evolving pretty rapidly. So as an applied engineering agency that cares a lot about protecting assets along the coastal zone, we care a lot about future changes. We need to know, are our shorelines going to continue to erode? Are they going to enhance erosion? Everything relating to future infrastructural risk, because these have significant costs for the US federal government. And what we see at the storm timescale, we can see a lot of erosion. And these may be from hurricane events, but relatively moderate nor'easters that just go for a couple days. Chew up beach systems, they threaten houses, they can cause large hazards to roadways or infrastructure or power grids, lots of critical resources. And so we may be interested in trying to mitigate some of this damage, both at the storm timescale and then over much longer timescales from sea level rise and climate change. So one thing that we've noticed is that dunes that I talked about at the beginning can be pretty effective at limiting some of these damages. They're topographically add features, they have lots of sediment, so during storms they can provide significant buffer to impacts from adjacent infrastructural assets. So that's motivated a lot of my work over the years. Just diving into a little bit in terms of the fundamentals and how we approach research on this topic. There's a nice conceptual model from a paper by Abby Salinger in 2000 that lays out 4 different regimes that we typically think about from dune impacts from water. So the swash regime is when you go out to the beach, there's water on the beach, you have areas you can lay down your towel, that's sort of a typical sunny day. The next level up is where you have water actually reaching up above the dune toe, and we typically think of dune erosion happening under these circumstances. Although actually my talk 6 or 7 years ago here was about how water can actually induce sediment transport into the dunes as well. So there's some limits to this conceptual model. And then we have more severe impacts where, if water is getting over the dune or wiping out the dune entirely, not surprisingly, then we're looking at pretty different morphologic responses. If we look at a wave climatology in terms of wave height on the upper panel, wave period, tides to water levels, and at the bottom we call total water levels, which is the complete water level hitting the dune. If we look at the Outer Banks where I live, or really pretty much any coastal system, what we realize all these red dots are showing when we're in the collision regime. This collision regime is really common. It happens 1-10 times a year from various storm events. Whereas overwash and inundation are much less frequent. That may be the 1 in 10 year, 1 in 100, 1 year, 1,000 year event that wipes out a dune system. And so when we're thinking about using soft infrastructure to protect against flooding, we really want to design for what these collisional dynamics are doing, because they're pretty frequent, they can cause a lot of erosion, and we need to make sure that we withstand those forces. So if we think about the big picture in terms of dunes, we already, as I described, may have wave-driven sediment losses, but we also have continual growth of these dunes from wind-driven sediment transport. So wind moves a lot of sand at a much lower rate than water, but it may blow much more frequently. So a lot of my work is driven around this topic of aeolian sediment transport, thinking about how dunes are growing with time. And we'll come back to both of these processes. But this is some morphology change from the West Coast and in Oregon, just because I had a video set up. But this is typical of all dunes for the most part. They're sort of by inherently aggradational features. They wouldn't exist if they were net erosional features. What you see in this topographic data from, I think it was 1998 to 2018, is that you're basically building an entire foredune along this coast with time. So in many places where we have topographic data over long timescales, it's really quite common to see dunes growing because there's more inputs from wind-driven sediment transport than losses via wave-driven sediment transport. If this wasn't the case, dunes would not likely naturally persist in these locations. So at least over timescales of relevance that we care about, years, decades, dunes are really common features. So there's lots of processes that influence dunes. There's also lots of processes that just affect sort of any coastal geomorphic feature. We can break these up into a range of different timescales. I'm not sure I totally agree with this diagram, but giving some highlights in terms of, relatively time and space scales. And so when I'm talking about dunes and thinking about the applied engineering needs in our civil works programs at the Corps of Engineers, we really care mostly about the mesoscale. We care about, how do I design a dune? What's its elevation going to be at this location? How is it going to evolve with time? And the bulk of my research is carried out about developing process-based numerical tools so we can answer these questions. But not surprisingly, those tools don't currently exist because we have to do research to get them to the point that they're useful and predictive, for an engineer trying to solve answers really rapidly. So I would say to answer this, you need to answer some questions across both wider time and space scales. So I'm going to talk about two main topics today. One, I'm going to talk about grain scale sediment transport, work that is ongoing through DoD funding, mostly through the Army, but some through civil works programs that feed into this need in terms of being able to answer mesoscale questions. And secondly, I'm going to skip on the complete opposite time scale and talk about decadal to century scale dune evolution and tools that we use to actually inform some of the mesoscale dynamics in terms of how we should be designing dunes. So completely different scales, mostly to give insights in terms of, topics that the Corps works on that I think are maybe a little bit untraditional, but maybe spark interest among the UNH group. All right, so I'm going to start with grain scale sediment transport. When I go and measure sediment transport on the beach, this may be an array that we put out, measuring all sorts of things about wind and sediment transport properties. So just a whole bunch of sensors that we put out for a DoD 6.1 program. And I was out there at 2 a.m. on a beach measuring things from Hurricane Isaias or Tropical Storm Isaias, and you can see there's a lot of wind-driven sediment transport. You get a lot of sediment moving when there's not a lot of precipitation and the winds are blowing really fast. But one thing I want to point out is that even though you have a lot of sand blowing, with in-situ sensors, this is a lot of in-situ sensors for sediment transport, you're still really under-resolving the sediment transport field. So you can answer some things about vertical variability in terms of transport rate, spatial variability, temporal variability, but you're always going to be somewhat sensor limited. And so we had the idea of thinking about how remote sensing maybe could inform something about spatial, temporal, magnitude of sediment transport. And so I think folks here are probably familiar with lidar technology. What we're going to do here is actually take a lidar, and rather than building a 3D scan of the room, we're going to point it in a single line and have it go back and forth as fast as we can. And by fast, I mean maybe 20 times a second we're measuring every point on the beach. And our hypothesis was that we could actually measure particles in the air with lidar. So let's show a video of that. And this is just a scan across the beach. The bed here is detrended until the noise you see in these blue panels is just showing little ripples. So the individual ripples have not yet been removed. And if you look at x equals 20, that's a little tweak sitting up. Just give you a sense of scale of resolution you can get with high resolution LiDAR. So this is over 20 meters of a beach. I'm going to play a video in a second, and this is a really short clip, just 5 minutes, just to give some insights in terms of what we can see. You'll see we're hovering right around the threshold velocity for wind-driven sediment transport. So really anything above 5.5, 6 meters per second, you might get some sediment transport. And what you'll see in this video is that once we get above 8 meters per second, the whole bed mobilizes. So between 6 and 8 meters per second, we're going to see spatially intermittent sediment transport, and then above some threshold, you basically have continuous transport everywhere. And so we start seeing here, blue dots are coming up. This is actually individual streamers moving through the field of view. And I'll show another picture of this later, but a big wind gust and basically everything mobilizes. So with this LiDAR technology at sub-second scale, we're actually measuring some properties of the sediment transport field, basically and across an entire area. So just zooming in, I think actually this is a different time period, but it's the same thought process. Here instead, looking over, you know, a 14-ish meters section of beach, just highlighting a couple time periods, and notably there's sometimes space gains above zero, so the whole sediment transport field is mobilized. But I just wanted to show an example of something that was zoomed in pretty considerably. Here we're just looking across a meter of beach. All of these points are individual returns. And notably, you know, if you have a high resolution sensor, you know, aggregated over 1 second, we're getting a lot of point returns. And so we see a lot of structure across the beach in terms of variability and how high off the bed individual particles are getting. And so we've been asking downstream questions about how is the bed controls, local ripples, changes in grain size characteristics and moisture, how does it affect the height of the bed? So asking some pretty detailed process-oriented questions that relate to sediment mobilization that we can implement to our models. If we take another picture of this, we can make a p-color plot on all of these panels. The x-axis is time. On the colored panel is a crush or a distance. And so this is the exact same thing we saw in the video from earlier, and I just want you to notice there's a lot of blues, not a lot happening basically for the bulk of this time, but the yellow strip is basically that whole sediment transport field being mobilized. And so now we have a, you know, time stack of what's happening in terms of a transport field. We can think about when sediment is being mobilized across the bed. So really asking questions about intermittency. So once we're really have a high velocity, you basically have continuous transport field, but we're usually in this intermittent zone where we're sort of above the threshold velocity, but not by a lot. So we're using this tool to think about intermittency in transport rates. So mostly highlighting the fact that, you know, using new sensors to ask some pretty cool new questions about crane scale dynamics. And I apologize, this is pulled from my paper, so there's a lot of points that probably shouldn't be in here, but the key point here is there's a bunch of colors. All of these are different ways to characterize the height of the saltation layer, so basically maximum or mean metrics of how high off the bed sand particles got. And on the x-axis here is just wind velocity, and so this was from that Hurricane Isaias example when you have sustained winds for sustained high winds for hours at a time. Each one of these dots I think is a 2-minute average. And what they all show is that as you get higher wind speed, the sediment particles get picked up and move higher off the bed. This may not be that surprising if it's more energetic that you have a larger amount of sediment transport. It also may skip up higher off the bed due to particle impacts off the bed lifting up. But this actually goes against conventional theory. So there was sort of a seminal paper from 5 years ago saying that there was some shear invariance to the saltation height. So we basically disproved this with new technology where you could actually start answering these questions about shear dependence on the transport field. And so I'm just going to show the equivalent picture on the left-hand side using those same in situ sensors that we had put out for that storm. So with in situ sensors, the whole point here is you can sort of see that there's a trend with the velocity or the shear velocity and the saltation height, but you get a lot more detail when you have a sensor that can actually measure these properties as opposed to point-based sensors, which are placed intermittently, you know, high above or below the transport field. So key point here, we have a new tool that we think there's a lot of potential to sort of think about grain scale sediment transport that has not been done in the aeolian transport field before, but still leaves a lot of open questions. And so we actually got motivated. We had this project doing this lidar saltation scans, but I started talking with colleagues about maybe other instruments we could adapt to see if we can also think about transport in aeolian systems. And one of these is a holographic camera system that's been used underwater to look at plankton, to look at bubbles, to look at suspended sediment transport, but hadn't been used for aeolian applications. So we had an unfunded project here where we tinkered out on the beach for some stormy conditions. And you're gonna look over here just about an hour where the wind conditions basically go up a little bit, but then they go down. And I'm gonna show you what we have in this holographic camera technology. And there's a hologram on the top here, which is just showing basically diffraction patterns around particles using inline holography. I'm not sure that I can go into the details of how it works exactly, but the key here is that you can actually pick out individual sand grains moving through more or less like a 5 centimeter by 5 centimeter cube. So relatively small, but it's an area as opposed to just a point. So you can pick out particles there, but based on the diffraction patterns, you can actually invert the exact elevation of those particles. So you can basically build from a picture a 3D map of particles over some area. And we can do this 10 times a second and start understanding how rates of transport are changing with time. So using the same sensors that we used before, those impact sensors I had in the picture, first thing we want to check with this holographic camera sensor is, does it actually measure sediment transport well, or does it have biases? And it compares really well to traditional in situ technologies. So, close to a 1-to-1 line there. And what we also see, not surprisingly, is that as the wind velocity gets higher, then the number of particles we see by that holographic camera sensor are also going up. So the holographic camera is not seeing every particle, so there's aliasing because it's not measuring fast enough, but it's getting the bulk trends in terms of the transport rates, right? And it's showing the expected trends that we have an increase in flux as you have increase in wind speed. So there's some pretty cool things we can do with this, because not only can we identify individual particles, but we can do image analysis to actually pick out the size of those particles and do shape statistics on them. So here is a time series, just 5 minutes, measured at 10 hertz in terms of the number of particles above the bed over just a 35 millimeter section. So showing that close to the bed, there's more sand particles than even 5 centimeters or 4 centimeters above. Once again, not surprising, but we're measuring things at really high resolution. And because we know the size of those particles now, we can actually get concentrations directly, which is often pretty hard to do. And as I said, we can do image analysis on the particles themselves. So we actually know the size of every grain that's moving through. So what do we see when we do some averaging is that close to the bed, you're going to see a particle size distribution. So this is the basically size of the whole grain size distribution, not just individual particles, but average, take all of our particles and build up a representation of what that whole particle size distribution looks like, that it's coarser near the bed and it's finer high above. And so that's shown by the right-hand panel as well in terms of a D50, that you basically have larger particles close to the bed and small particles can jump higher up. Not surprising, but we're measuring this in super high detail. So the more interesting thing that we found was that typically with lower wind speeds that are close to the threshold velocity here, so something in this case close to 8 meters per second, we would actually expect that we have smaller grains mobilized within the siltation layer than if we have a higher wind velocity, which is able to move more sediment, but also move bigger particles. And so we see the opposite there. So in this case, as you get a higher wind speed, we're actually decreasing the size of our particles. And this actually relates to the time series itself in terms of what the winds are doing. They start high and they go, ultimately start tapering off. And under those higher wind conditions, we're basically winnowing out all the fine. This is a good example of just showing just the heterogeneity of sediment that we typically see on coastal systems, that all these fine particles can quickly be removed from the surface, leaving across much coarser or heavier particles at the bed. And so we're actually measuring this winnowing process directly with a sensor now, which really hasn't been done, at least not with like sediment trappings that may have to be manually removed. So here's another additional tool for measuring sub-second grain scale sediment transport. We think has a lot of potential, mostly just showing off things that we think are really interesting, and we just published a paper pretty recently on that. All right, so we do some stuff at the grain scale that, if we're clever, we can actually reparameterize things about grain scale sediment transport that feed into our aeolian transport models that have mostly been done in desert systems, but haven't been done a lot specifically in coastal systems where things like moisture and heterogeneous grain sizes matter a lot. And so we're thinking about how to translate that into our mesoscale tools. But I want to talk quickly about sort of the second scale, thinking about long-term dune evolution and some dune design questions that are feeding into more process-based tools. And as we think more on this predictive side, we don't just care about wind-driven sediment transport. We start caring about all sorts of things like vegetation and anthropogenic effects like putting up sand fences. And so building tools, we have to think about all of these different range of processes that all influence what the landscape looks like. And over long time scales, we care about storms, we care about sea level rise, we care what the beach is doing. And so the details start mattering. So we have a range of different tools that we can use to think independently about the wave-driven sediment transport processes or the wind-driven sediment transport processes. And these have really been sort of developed separately. We've always treated the coastal system sort of independently in terms of those different processes. And it's only more recently shown in the bottom here that we started building integrated models that include as one subaerial and subaqueous models. And this is what I've spent a good portion of my PhD on, and actually at the core as well. So I focus a lot on this process-based model development where we can include ecomorphodynamic effects, all sorts of things about the anthropogenic system. We can't do that with lower fidelity tools, as shown here, whether they're conceptual models or analytical models, but we can still help those simpler tools to help inform design. And so that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today, is really leveraging some analytical models that are a little bit more stable over these longer timescales that can still give us insights into behavior. So if we build a framework thinking about coastal systems and dunes in particular, we can break this out into the beach and dune system. We've already talked about the Salinger storm impact scale, so you know what swash is, what collision is. But we often represent things in terms of a total water level, which is basically how high up on the beach water gets. It's a statistical quantity, and it includes wave runup. And so there's a bunch of empirical approaches to get wave runup. This is basically an equation from Stockton et al. 2006 that's quite commonly used in our field. And if we add this to the still water level, see what the tides are doing, we get our total water level. And we care a lot about where that total water level is relative to the dune toe, like I showed in those videos earlier. When water levels exceed the dune toe, we typically predict that there's volume losses. And so there's also equations in the literature, mostly derived from lab experiments, but validated against field data as well, that can come up with the volume changes based on the freeboard of that total water level above the dune toe. And so in the simple tool that I've been developing, that I'm going to show some results in a minute, we're basically based on this concept that we can predict volume losses, mostly based on this total water level concept, where there's one coefficient, the CS term, that can also be related to things like grain size, can be related to vegetation characteristics of the internal dune. So there's also some site-specific parameterization. And when we're thinking on these long timescales, we also have to contribute the wind. And so there's a lot of equations, empirical equations that can predict wind-driven sediment transport. This is an example from Kawamura. And this is really where that field data that I talked about earlier can help parameterize coefficients, threshold velocities, other terms that go into equations like this. In these simplified frameworks over long timescales, we also care a lot about what the beach is doing. This can be pretty hard to model over decadal to century timescales, but things that we can impose into a simplified numerical model framework include shoreline retreat. And if we include an imposed shoreline retreat, we can also characterize time evolution of the beach slope characteristics that relates to the total water level. And as I mentioned before, we care a lot about sea level rise. And so in any tool that we're thinking about these sort of more macro scale timescales, we pretty much have to address sea level rise. So just want to point out that we've been validating the erosional engines a little bit to a degree, the accretional engines. So we've done some work up in Alaska, showing some validation here of this empirical approach over decadal scale. And actually applied to data where I work in Kentucky, North Carolina. These empirical models actually did better at this storm time scale than process-based models like X-Beach and Seashore, which is a core developed model. So it's also interesting that the simpler models sometimes win. Partly motivating why we're using it here. And all of our code, I'll just point out, is open source. So anything that I work on as a federal employee, we put in the public domain. So that's important. All right, so we built a simplified numerical model framework, trying to cover a lot of topics, so I'll go really quickly. But similar to before, we have wave heights, wave periods, basically what our tides are doing, and then in this case, wind speeds. And if we plug this into this simple tool we developed before, we can predict volume change with time of a dune system. We can also predict morphological changes if we had some rules. And I'm just going to focus in terms of volume changes. So the key here is that over this 100-year simulation or out to 2100, the number is positive. So what this is saying is that if we have some forecast that goes out to the future, we're predicting that our dune is net accretional. This is consistent with what I said before, that in many places dunes are naturally growing features. And we can take a pretty deterministic approach. We do this a lot in coastal engineering work that say, I'm going to add the NOAA sea level rise curve and see how my response is. And so now instead we have the same environmental time series, and now instead of a programming dune, we basically have a dune that goes through periods of erosion and then subsequent recovery. and we end up with 0. So, just that dune may still be there in 100 years, may not be. And that's a problem with deterministic models is we have one answer and it's dependent highly in terms of what we say the winds and the waves are going to look like in 2048 at 12 o'clock. And we have no idea what they're going to look like, right? So oftentimes just taking a forecast isn't that useful in getting one answer out. So we've been thinking a lot about with these tools that we're developing, how can we put this in probabilistic space? Because this is really important for how we design this dune. And it's really important for those houses behind the beach in terms of whether they're protected or not, because if we get this wrong, they're pretty easily going to be gone. So how we've been getting around this is starting to think about clever statistical climate emulation approaches. So I work a lot with Dylan Anderson, who's now at the core as well. Mostly work coming out of the University of Cantabria and Oregon State University in terms of thinking about statistical representations of climate forcings at basin scale and how those ultimately relate to weather. So we use, in this case, autologistic regression techniques based on sea level pressure fields, which define weather pretty well. And from that, we start coming up with representative patterns in terms of what weather looks like at a basin scale. And what we find when we can do that is that we can describe potential outcomes for different weather types in terms of what environmental forces look like. And those environmental forces can include wave height and wave period and wave directionality and wind speeds and storm surge and non-tidal residuals. So we can do this with basically any environmental characteristic, shown here by some example probability distributions for different sea level pressure field patterns. And I know that I'm rushing through this, but I'm trying to get to the fun stuff, which is the morphology change. But basically this technique, what it allows us to do is synthesize future environmental forcings. So we can come up with century scale predictions of what waves look like at hourly time scale that are statistically representative of present climate. And if we add non-stationarity into this, we can also predict future climate states. And that's what we work on a lot at the moment. And we can roll the dice numerous times and we can actually predict thousands of representations of what these wave wind time series can look like and force these into any coastal hazard model. In this case, it's going to be for dune prediction. And just because I work in duck and we have a bunch of data, we're going to use data from the duck coastline. So just showing here some representative dunes that basically are forced into this model. All right, so we had our example time series and then prediction in terms of dune evolution before. So let's roll the dice again on different environmental forcings. So here, basically using a stochastic emulator, in this case, we could still have a positive net positive dune growth, but the trajectory that it got there is very different than before. We could roll the dice again, get different representations of future storms. Once again, we may have a positive dune growth, but different iterations of storms and sequencing of storm surge and large wave events. And we keep doing this over and over and we can come up with a range of potential outcomes. In this case, it's 1,000 different simulations with different boundary conditions. And you can start getting a range of outcomes rather than a just deterministic single simulation. We see there's a range of responses that on average, these dunes may be growing. So the number is positive in the black line, which is the mean, but the entire range of results shown in gray includes negative values. So we may start thinking about, well, what's my probability that a dune is going to be there at 2050 or 2075? So no longer are we stuck with, hey, this is definitely what's going to happen. It's more what could happen in the future. And we can add things like shoreline change rates. And what we see is that if we have a negative shoreline change rate, this really imposes what's going to happen in the future. If you have a rapidly eroding shoreline, there's really no way to keep a dune in place, past decadal scale. That the beach is highly coupled to what the dune is going to do. So there's lots of things we can do with these models. We can think about the probability of destruction that I talked about before. On the left-hand side, that's just showing different shoreline change rates. As I said, it's what the dunes do are strongly coupled to the beach morphodynamics. And basically, if you have anything over about 40 centimeters per year of loss over decadal scale, you basically have a 100% chance that dune is going to get eroded out. And the time scale of that destruction is much larger depending on the shoreline change rate. But this is just synthesizing that same thing. And I just want to start pointing out that we have different regimes. That if you have a pretty stable shoreline, our life cycle of dunes is really driven by infrequent storms. So infrequent events. If you have a large shoreline change rate, everything is really dominated by the shoreline dynamics. And then we have this intermediate zone where both storms and the shoreline dynamics both make a difference in terms of the resilience of dunes. And the green line added here is just saying sea level rise changes a lot of these things. So we add in additional hazards in addition to shoreline change rates. Not surprisingly, some of these dynamics change. And so, we think about these macro scales to help inform how should we design dunes now so that they're resilient not just for 5 years, but 15 years, 20 years. Skip through that because I'm pretty much out of time. So putting this in terms of what the core needs are, we're also using this to think about, what are our volume needs? How big should we build an initial dune? So based on local shoreline change rates, we can say we need to build a massive dune or a small dune. And using these tools, we can self-inform, the potential for that system to remain in place in the context that it's going to naturally go from wind-driven processes as well. And so we're often thinking about, well, what's our life cycle to come back and renourish or rebuild the dune? Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? And so, these tools can be useful for thinking about those things. And more importantly, this tool that I talked about, we traditionally only include either wind-driven processes or only wave-driven processes. And so this line is just showing the fact that our volume needed to grow a dune may be substantially less when we account for wind-driven processes. So, using building with nature, engineer with nature processes can actually help save us a lot of money in the long term if we factor in these aggregate wind-driven processes into these modeling tools. All right, so we covered a bunch of time and space scales. I didn't go into really into the mesoscale dynamics, but that's actually mostly what I work on. So that's for another day. I think I'm just gonna put some highlights, but I don't really need to talk about that. I think my last slide, because you just heard me talk for 45 minutes, will just be the plug that I'm supposed to tell everybody that there's a bunch of summer internships. So if you think any of this stuff is interesting, we do a lot of hiring. So if you're interested in working in Duck or Vicksburg on these topics, specifically we have funding for working with me with coastal morphology development or grain size work. There's a lot of work on surf zone, autonomous systems with robots, and a lot of remote sensing work, some from near field and then some from space that, there's lots of opportunities. So with that, I'll take any questions if people have them.
This was a fascinating tour de force from fundamental boundary layer transport properties to risk in coastal zones. This was pretty amazing. Can you go back to the slide? I want to ask a question about one thing. Can you go back, if you go back one slide, or if, keep going back to the, where you show the videos with the aeolian transport on the sand, what we started with?
Oh, like early.
Yeah, early on, and there was another following video that sort of passed through. Keep going.
The winds and the waves?
No, the first, this one exactly. So if you show this video, what I'm pretty sure you see here are these energetic streaky structures in the inertial sublayer of the boundary layer that actually pick up the sand and transport it. And then you had another video following a little bit later where you showed that your wind direction actually came from the water over waves, so different direction.
Yep.
Your measurements are at one location, right? And there's a lot of evidence that turbulent boundary layers strongly depend on how they were generated, the initial conditions and all that. So with your data, I mean, it's great to see it all, cluster and sort of collapse. But did you notice some significant differences in transport rates, whether the wind, when you modified these initial conditions on how the boundary layer actually evolved and came to you?
Yeah, so there's we work for a really random agency. We have lots of random topics we work on, and so actually have a wind resolving Doppler lidar that measures the boundary layer. So I didn't talk about that here, but depending on the wind direction that's coming in, the boundary layer structure looks really different if it's coming from the ocean versus if it has any interaction with land. And so that makes a big difference in terms of what the shear velocity looks like at the bed in terms of the overall structure of that atmospheric boundary layer. And so there's big differences in terms of the near bed velocities. So I think there's a lot there. We've been sort of in data collection mode as opposed to understanding the implications. But I think everything we've seen about being able to build the vertical structure of the wind velocity field, sort of every meter from the ground up a couple hundred meters, is that there's huge differences in the structure depending on the interaction with the topography versus the ocean. So of course that's going to affect the sediment transport too. So more fundamental questions for sure.
Can we talk a little bit about how some of the second part of your talk would change if you considered winter conditions, freeze, thaw, snow in that environment? Because I think you said you did some work in Alaska as well.
Yep. Yeah, a lot of our Alaska work I work on is on the wave-driven side and not the wind-driven side. And so, we're thinking about a lot of thermal processes for, particularly for resolving permafrost and tundra. And of course, that's going to reduce transport rates considerably. But then you have other mechanisms when you get to tundra in terms of like block failure mechanisms and things that are unrelated to the wave-driven processes, but are more related to thermal processes. If you were dealing with systems like this in the continental US, like snow and iced over conditions, that can really quickly shut off wind-driven sediment transport fields because moisture plays a big role in that. Well, you just have no sediment supply if you're covered in snow and ice. And undoubtedly it's going to have the same effect in terms of wave-driven processes, except that I guess you could imagine in a case where waves are not frozen and could glide over the beach, and maybe there's the potential that it exacerbates erosion in certain locations as well, just changing where sediment is sourced from. So I don't have answers on all that, but actually those are surprisingly topics that we are thinking a lot about because we do feel a lot of questions from like our Great Lakes offices, from Maine, other places where all these things are really relevant and have sort of traditionally been ignored, right? We built a lot of tools to deal with hurricanes and not much else. So I don't have the answers, but those are things that would be fun to work on.
I'm wondering about the vegetation and the effects of the environment, that stabilizing factor. Given that there's increased carbon dioxide and increased nutrients, we should expect increased vegetation and therefore increased stability on the dunes. Is that true?
I think generally that's true if the system stays as is, but if you also are moving into an erosional, more disturbance, then you're also going to put more stressors on the vegetation, and so there's a potential that you have entire ecological shifts as well. And from changes in air temperature, you're also changing the range of a lot of species, particularly along the Atlantic East Coast. So you're starting to see like different dominant species in certain locations. And so depending on the species type, you have both different external characteristics, so different ability to trap wind-blown sediment transport. There's huge species dependence in terms of like what the dune shape looks like depending on wind-driven sediment transport rates. But actually more importantly for your question actually is that the root biomass looks really different depending on species. And so there's a lot of like weird nonlinear effects here. Honestly, a lot of the invasive species have the most internal biomass in the dunes, but those are the species that, from a coastal resilience point of view may make good sense for stabilizing your dune, but from an ecosystem services perspective would be really bad. So there's never one right answer here about, the role of vegetation, but pretty much in all these projects, if you want to stabilize a dune, you can't just leave it as a sand pile, it will blow away. You need to have something that causes spatial sediment transport gradients to stabilize it. And so that's either going to be from vegetation or it's going to be from sand fencing. So one of those is always incorporated into these projects. And I think there's a lot of work going on now in terms of trying to pick out the exact right species for particular locations, the density effects, because these make a big difference, both in terms of the external and internal characteristics of dunes. I don't know if I answered all your questions, but it's an important point. Tom, you still have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Yeah, this is a really good talk. It made me think a little bit about your stuff where you had to specify the shoreline change in order to get the dune response. Is there any way to drive a model like this for the 100-year kind of time frame without having to specify that with something like, I don't know, sea level rise, water levels, or sources and sinks of sediments and playing with those kinds of things? Or are you sort of stuck right now specifying what that shoreline change has to be?
No, for sure not. I mean, when coding these models, you just add a new way of doing that. So you could add the Brune rule into there to.
Well, not just the Brune rule, but something maybe more predictive in a process-based kind of.
And if you had considerable offshore like transport or wave angles, you could link it with a shoreline change model, which would probably be the better way of doing that if your shoreline changes are driven by sediment losses, down the coast.
So you
I think
would
there's lots of
so
ways
you
to
would decouple the shoreline change from the dune response. Predict the shoreline change however you want, stick it into your model, predict that dune response. There's no way to really couple those. At least, I would imagine it's hard, but
But I think the way that I've been trying to use these tools is to help inform what the more process-oriented questions we have to ask are, right? You know, we can understand general systems behavior this way. And first order, you know, imposing a large shoreline change rate, we know that that's like a first order effect in terms of whether those dunes are going to be stabilized, right? And so it actually motivates the point that you do need to understand the beach morphodynamics to get at what the dune resilience is. You know, I would love to do that with process-based tools like, you know, sediment conservation and dealing with wave physics and but the reality is over those timescales, those models break down pretty considerably and there's a huge computational cost. So I think it's a trade-off, but at the very least it motivates the fact that we need to get that right. Most of these models do beach morphodynamics over, you know, more than the storm timescale pretty badly. And so that sort of feeds into our R&D cycles. We identify what we're doing wrong, why we can't use those tools to answer questions at this timescale, and then try to motivate, you know, doing more work in that arena.
do we have enough data now to go back in time and do hindcasting with 50 years of shoreline change data in some places or more? To see if these models can predict based on what you know, what happened in the past
Well,
in some areas.
yeah, I mean, there was like the Shorecast study that like put a bunch of models to the test to try to do all of these things. You know, putting them all head to head, they still all have huge errors. So can it tell you something about whether the beach is growing or eroding in general magnitudes? It tells you something. Is it going to get it exactly right? Probably not. And so I think it depends on the level of detail and precision that you need.
Yeah, thanks.
Nick, I think you suggested, and it makes sense, that the saltation height is correlated to the boundary layer thickness. And saltation and the magnitude of saltation is going to be correlated to, I suspect, what you call U threshold, the wind speed needed to mobilize the sediment. I can imagine, though, that that is a function of moisture of the bed. So when the beach is dry, you're going to see more aeolian transport. And can you comment on that? Because that, for places in macrotidal beaches, that's going to really matter.
Yeah, so the threshold velocity, which is basically, you know, the wind speed that you need to mobilize a sand grain, is indeed dependent primarily on the grain size, and then it's modified by moisture. And so we have empirical approaches to account for that. So if you're in a fully saturated soil, it's going to be very hard to mobilize sediment. If you actually go to systems like this is actually a video from Oregon, and you can see the bed is really wet. Honestly, it doesn't take much out it doesn't take much wind to actually dry out a really thin layer of the surface. And so, you know, most of our moisture measurements are sort of aggregated using in situ measurements over a pretty large scale. But we're talking about laying out one or drying out sort of one grain size thickness, and it's actually not that hard. And so if you have standing water, it's not going to happen. But, you know, higher up in the swash zone, on individual, like in between individual swash pores, you can see sediment being mobilized by wind. So it's a complicated topic. It's another area where I think lidars are useful because you also get some insights on that same time scale from the reflectance in terms of what the moisture is doing. So I think the current approaches to dealing with moisture are probably inadequate in coastal systems for sure.
Yeah, thanks. And to follow up on Martin's question, have you done any work with triggering the boundary layer? So I'm thinking Brad Werner style, build a bump or make a hole or a certain distance from where you're measuring to see whether or not you can sort of make it dance the way you want?
No, but we did just move like a high-tech wind flume from Colorado State to Vicksburg. That you can control everything about the moisture and the humidity, so it's sort of like a climate change wind chamber that I think there's a lot in the pipeline that we're probably going to do a little bit more of those control things where we can also look at 3D wind fields and effects. And so there's some scalability issues there, but I think that's a potential resource to be able to get at some of these questions that may be a little bit hard in the field.
Okay, thanks.
You need a really large facility for these structures to get enough energy to pick up sediment. So really small scale plumes or flat small scale wind tunnels, you may not quite see it.
Yep. Yeah, and so, you know, we can also do these things in in the field. I think you'd want to do it on a dissipative setting like this where you tend to have pretty considerable transport rates because you have a large fetch. So I think you'd want to pick the right site to probably do that.
Has the process of the vegetation impact the accuracy of the model?
So I think the question was, does the vegetation impact the results of the modeling work? So in the example that I showed, we didn't directly include vegetation because it's mostly dealing with sediment fluxes. So it's assumed that the wind-driven sediment transport is deposited on the dune in a certain way. In reality, that would be vegetation specific. And so the work that I didn't talk about is that we're doing a lot at the moment in terms of parameterizing vegetation effects on the shear coupling with a bed shear stress field. And so that's a lot of ongoing work that's using, process-based experiments, mostly in the field, a little bit from the lab, to actually inform new parameterizations in higher fidelity tools, where we're trying to take a lot of these effects. So like I add things about sand fences into morphological models and adding in species-dependent vegetation effects. So that's things that we're really headed towards because those are all the applied questions that we get is about what species should I plant? How is that going to affect my dune shape, my dune form? So I don't think we're quite there, so it wasn't included in these simulations, but I think that's where a lot of the work is going in terms of individual species intensity effects in terms of morphological patterns.
One more question.
One more. So in your in situ measurements with the lidar and the hologram camera, it's like really neat to see it, but you saw that there's a lot of spatial and temporal variability, unsurprisingly. So I mean, what do you think is sort of next to constrain that and like get a parameterized flux of sediment given some wind conditions? Is there a path forward, or is it just sort of understanding how variable it is?
Well, I think in all these measurements that you see and all the videos that you see is that there's a lot of intermittency in transport, and all of our sort of simplified empirical equations basically assume steady state transport fields over long time periods, which we know isn't true. And in reality, when we look at coastal systems, actually, let's say the threshold velocity for mobilizing that sediment is actually like 8 meters per second. But if the wind falls below 8 meters per second, the sediment transport field doesn't actually stop. So there's actually a second threshold for cessation that's different. And that's not something we include in any of these tools. And so you basically have like dual threshold effects. And I sort of mentioned it before, but I didn't talk in detail that I think where some of the lidar technology could be useful is that you actually are sort of measuring that in the effect that we know when there's continuous transport across the whole beach, and then we know when there's spatially intermittent transport. And so we're sort of, with that, I think we can actually inform what those two thresholds are effectively. Because I think the continuous transport is more analogous to how we currently treat wind-driven sediment transport in steady state models. But the reality is most of the time we're sort of in this zone of like quasi sediment transport, and that's where we get things really wrong.
Can I ask one final question? And you don't have to answer. The map depiction of the UK, why does the US Army Corps cut off Scotland?
I didn't think of that. But we do have a London international office.
Right, but if you look at the map, Scotland is missing for some reason. I don't know.
I
It's
can't-
the US Army Corps. Is it an agenda or? Never mind.
It's the next step of Brexit.
We wanted to get you thinking about it.
Right, on that note, let's thank you again.